This game begins, obviously,
with continue.
Hi, hello, and welcome to Inscryption, a fun digital card game with many overlapping mechanics, where you play against the mysterious dealer in the shadows. But you know, most games need some kind of setup of a dealer or another. Though over time, if you do look into the shadows a bit, you'll end up seeing... Though when beginning to talk about this entirely normal game, let's talk about what's around the table itself first. To begin with, you have the scale. Points is not an additive to who reaches one first, it's whoever reaches a maximum over whatever the other has scored. So tip their side of the scale before they tip yours. Don't worry about what happens if the scale's tipped, that's entirely fine. If you tip an enemy's scale, you move out of the encounter and on to the next. If an enemy tips your scale, you lose a life represented by these candles. And if you lose both, don't worry, just don't worry about it. Next to the scale, you have the bell. This bell you just ring at the end of your turn to mark that it moves to the enemy's turn. That's all it does. Continuing on to the left, you have the guidebook, which ends up having all the rules for a lot of the overlapping mechanics that, especially early on, it's nice to have off to the left and easy access. Though it's less the mechanics directly and more things called sigils, which we'll talk about with the cards. So in this game, you have two decks. You have your regular deck and your squirrel deck. Yeah, it's just squirrels. Squirrels themselves don't just stand out, namely because, well, they're squirrels. It's the fact that the rest of the cards are beasts. What makes them stand out is the fact they have their own separate deck, and they're just, again, garbage stats. Though when opening up the rest of the deck, you might see that there's a cost above it, namely with these little droplets of blood. You sacrifice cards. You know, like turning a land card, except they're shaking and quivering and then you stab them. This is one of two currencies you have within this game, so the first is sacrifices, so how many sacrifices does it take to summon one card onto the battlefield immediately on the 4 different tiles you have? And the second resource is what's called bones. When it comes to sacrifice, it's an immediate effect on your turn. You have to sacrifice the number equal to the card you want to place down to be able to place it. It's not something you can save up. Bones, you do save up. With sacrifice, you have a choice on when and what to use and burn. Bones, you have to rely upon things dying. Specifically your cards, it's not killing enemy cards giving you bones. But one of the benefits of bones compared to sacrifice is that it lies off to the side in a pile and you can stockpile it, so then you can play a series of them on a same turn. Speaking of resources that aren't just cards, you also have items that you can get and pick up and place on the side of your table. One of these is a squirrel in a bottle, which gives you a free squirrel card, which, you know, you can avoid having to draw a card in the first place from the squirrel pile, or you can draw 2 to be able to sacrifice 2 in a turn. Alongside that, there's other items you can pick up on the map, because this is the roguelite. Not really a world map, but it's branching paths to different events and encounters that you pick from in between each encounter. And so you can do things like pick up items, upgrade cards, sacrifice things, and it's lovely that when you head through some of these different events that it's this nice, eerie, creepy woodland vibe. It's just a really cool theme and aesthetic. This map being rolled out on the table and moving a wooden piece of your caricature running through it. The whole deck of beasts and woodland animals. It's like Pokemon, both actual animals. Though on top of those encounters, the actual combat. So, when you're in a combat encounter, or card encounter in this sense, at the start of the encounter you have 4 different lanes and your starting hand. You also have to do as your first action to draw from either the deck or the scroll deck. Though after you've done that, you can place whatever you can within that round, any number of sacrifices or spaces that you have. Then when you end your turn, all your cards are going to fight. If there's nothing blocking them, they're going to hit the enemy. As in the dealer, which will end up giving you the points on the scale. To win, tip down their scale. To lose, your scale comes down, and then that thing we just, you know, it's entirely normal, I don't know what you're talking about. Though when it comes to the cards themselves, the 2 stats all of them have are their health and power. So the amount of damage they can take and the amount of damage they can deal. Though outside of that initial power, you end up having sigils. So this is where the guidebook comes back in, and the fact that these sigils can change the way a card functions. These sigils add on and on and on, and you can even have cards with multiple sigils. It's really there in a lot of the choices and decisions based off the sacrifice and bones you have to make when placing your cards. As in, that's where a lot of the fun and depth of this game comes in. Because it is honestly a really fun card game when you find synergies on specific sigils, different combos with cards and decks. Not to mention, to shake things up a bit, outside of some of the other encounters, you have boss fights. Now, to not spoil too much, I'm just going to mention the first boss fight because it's on the cover. The Prospector. As the dealer puts on a mask and begins acting out as this character, it has 2 phases, and your life goes down to 1. Doesn't matter if you had 2, it goes down to 1. Though with trying not to spoil much, I'm gonna end it there as there's a few other bosses, and honestly, this game is fun. It's got a grand recommendation from me. It's a nice, simple card. That good? Good. Okay. Welcome to Zaktact, where we talk about cards, and more cards. In today's episode, it's not just the history of one of the big players, but instead, a cancelled release. Now, most think that the game Inscryption itself never got a release, and that the game just went under development within the process itself, but it didn't go down with the company. Not before it could get a few sets of demo cards out. Now, the game itself... This is your second point of warning. The game itself, Inscryption... Trust me, you don't want it spoiled. This isn't me telling you or warning you, this is me asking you to trust me on this. You do not want this game spoiled if you ever plan on playing it. And if you really want to finish this video or hear what's about to be said, go and play it, come back, then we can continue. The video will still be here. But your experience won't.
Your experience is with the game.
Go play it.
Play it now.
Okay, now that that's over, and that we're all above board now, let's actually gush about the game for a bit. Namely that this game is going to screw with your head, or has screwed with your head, and again, this is your last chance, because we're about to be going into Act 1 and 2, yes, there's acts. So what we've covered so far is kind of the core of the game, in the sense that it's going to carry through a lot of the acts. Not necessarily the items, but the cards especially. Oh, speaking of items, yep, that one. Yep, I loved seeing that for the first time. Because that's really a lot of the initial first area, your first response to a lot of things in this game, is the, oh wow, this is either weird, mysterious, creepy on some levels, and then also, wait, that's a thing? Isn't this just a card game? And, well, it's a bit more than that. Namely, because it's a full-on point-and-click adventure, in first person. It's not, in the sense, just on the card game and being able to click around the table, no, because you can get up. In Act 1, there's a whole cabin to explore. You still can't see the dealer, and then there's that thing. But you have different puzzles to sort out, you have different items around, things that you don't even know how to unlock or interact with yet. It's such an additional layer to the game itself, and now has you questioning, why is the card game happening here? Why is this a thing you can do? What's that flashing ominous light? And why is that where my character goes when they die? Less goes, more dragged and forced to take a picture of. Which might not sound bad picture-wise, except... yeah, though also that mechanic itself not just being a random assortment or a random card placed down, but you get to pick your own stats ahead of time on what Leshy is taking a picture of, that's really fun. And you can make busted stuff. That is another thing about this game, is that you are allowed to customize cards at various points in the game, and is to bust things. It is to break things. Not just in combos and cards themselves, but this allows you to make busted individual cards, or abilities, or combined sigils. While in Act 1, it's through this picture method, and also the Mushroom Men. Though even when you die, you still carry on your cards moving forward, which is really nice. The ominous, creepy events, the gamble of holding on to pelts from the trapper to be able to get to the trader later on to buy cards, unlocking weird and strange things later on, and just the questions that keep going and going and going. Namely as well, why the game was just continue instead of start new game. This was in the middle of whatever was going on. Just consistent questions piling and piling and piling and piling. And then eventually, you get to the end of Act 1.
Hey there, card gamers. I'm the Lucky Carter, and this is another pack opening video. Today, I am opening Catch Monsters packs and digging for that epic, shiny Transcendent!
And then something strange happens. A voice we've heard a handful of times, some kind of commenter of some kind, that has poked in, namely at the start, talking about the game booting up for the first time, and in reaction to some things going on. But it's here that you see who it is, the Lucky Carter. Namely recordings of the Lucky Carter as the battery had died and the battery had been recharged, finally giving some context as to what's going on initially with the game, as it's not just you playing this, there's a player character. That's the Lucky Carter, or Luke. Opening some old packs from a garage sale on his YouTube channel, he finds coordinates. And there, he finds a floppy disk for a digital version of the game Inscryption. The game you're playing. You get these video clips throughout the game, and also plays into a bit of an ARG thing that goes on, but these add context to what's going on just outside of the game itself. Filling in the mystery on what's going on outside of the game and how did this get made in the first place and what's going on with it. Because it is not acting normally. But after that, you have a new game, you start it, and it starts as it was meant to. So the entire card game itself was split into 4 different types of cards. And the first one's with the talk of the 4 scribes. Of these 4 scribes, one's our dealer, and the other 3 were members from the cards. But as we march off in this new Act 2, the art style has changed. There isn't a cabin to jump out of except an overworld within the game. This isn't to say there isn't any secrets. There still are, both meant for the game itself and then also the weirder kind of secrets. Individuals who make cards in different manners and shape the world around them. They're the rulers of this land and you're here to replace one of them. At least in the setting of the game. Like, that's the starting point for the in-game game. And speaking of those bosses, let's talk with familiar one. In one of the other sections, you come down to beast cards. Now, when it comes to beast cards, they're a bit, how to put it, a bit strange, as in you kind of expect some of these things like deer, squirrel, wolf, and though this does have actually the sacrifice mechanic, which you might think might be a death, but that's just if a card dies. When it comes to the sacrifice mechanic, well, Leshy, the Scribe of Beasts, and his packs and cards are the same you've seen. They're all the sacrifice mechanic. Though no bones, notably. That's a different scribe. So the familiar face, Beasts, Sacrifice, and Leshy. The Scribe of Beasts out in his cabin in the woods, with the Prospector and Angler being different characters, not just the bosses and masks he put on. Same with the Trapper. You do have to actually duel those people within card games to be able to get the Leshy in the first place. Gaining new decks along the way, from interacting with the environment to solving some minor puzzles and aiding them and also finding weird secrets. Leshy's boss fight was actually really funny, because it's based off whatever initially dies, you get your hand replaced by whatever the stats are taken pictures of. So, he takes 3 pictures for the different stats. You know, it's price, health, damage. So if you just had the same thing die over and over again, like squirrels for example, you just got a handful of squirrels. Oh, also sigil. But you get to Leshy, you beat him, one of the scribes done. On to the next one. If I remember correctly, dead. Not undead, not death. Not like necromancy or something, or like dead? What kind of name's that for an entire card? Grimoire! Nice play on the word grimoire. The Scribe of the Dead, after a familiar face Leshy, this is the new one. Though not as new as you'd think. This is where the bones mechanic is, and you also might have noticed on top of that and the sacrifice mechanic previously mentioned, there's a few other things listed out in the top left. That's because even though we're out of Leshy's territory, every rule within each of these 4 different domains overlaps each other and is active at the same time. You can carry cards from any of them, but messing with bones, cards that die on their own, and meeting the Scribe of the Dead. When it comes to Grimoire, she notes down the cards that died, as in they're gonna come back in phase 2. After defeating these 2, getting half of the scribes down, the bridge in the center is repaired, and you can move on to the other 2. Now, for possibly the most generic / we're trying to make an excuse to have a different name, Magics. What kind of name's Magics anyway? Just put Magic. We all know what you're going for. Maybe even Mana, that's another generic term you can use, but Magics? It's just such a stupid name. Magnificus, the worst wizard teacher. / painter. Well, the painter part might not be bad. Once you get to his classic wizard tower, there's some puzzles, then you have to fight the 3 apprentices, and make your way all the way up to Magnificus himself, the weird tree painter. The mechanic for this area and cards, the Magus cards, Magics, are these 3 different types of gems for placing down cards and also buffing them in the first place. So instead of necessarily a price to place a card down, it's specifically a gem to have the card work in the first place. Not for all of them, they get really weird and funky and it's all about combos, even more so than any of the others through convenience. Though the scribes themselves, oh man, these poor scribes. Magnificus turn one into goo. And oh man, the sad interaction of if you let him win. Another's just an eternal head living on a pike. And the last one, put in the worst sensory deprivation tank ever, as in it's magic and you're just in a floating void somewhere. But then you fight Magnificus. An annoying fight. Real annoying. Great music, by the way. Like, really good music for this fight specifically. There's good music all around through the entire game, but here, ooh, I remember the music from this fight. Also because it's annoying. Not the music of the fight because, oh, you drew a card? Congrats! I'm gonna paint a new sigil on it, whether it had one or not. And it also removes the sigil if it did. God, that's really... It's still like the gems and all about the comboing thing, but man, you really have to basically scrap half my deck. These changes only last for the initial fight, so you don't have to worry about cards being ruined, but it's still annoying to fight. Though we move on to our 4th and final. And then technology, which is our 4th and final of these sections. Though, honestly, if you ask me, out of the stuff from the demo that could be found, it's the least finished. It just feels like it's missing something, or it's just trying to piece itself together. P03, the Scribe of Technology, who manufactures his cards. You can walk right up to him, he's just not going to duel you until you deal with something going wrong in manufacturing. Which you have to convince these bots, which... But in dueling these bots and technology cards, you have power. So it starts at 1 on the first round and ends up going by an additional 1 at the start of the next round, and keeps going out until it's at 6 max. There are cards and certain abilities that you might be able to push it further and recharge it faster, or even recharge it in the middle of a round. Probably the second most passive of a lot of these. You don't need to combo specific gems on the table, you don't need to end up sacrificing some of the cards you place down, or hope that some of them die in a specific order to get bones. You just gotta wait or build up charge. How are you using it in the meantime? After talking to the Dredger, you talk to PO3 themselves, and duel. Again, this fight can kind of be a coin flip on annoying or really easy. The entire thing's on a rotating conveyor belt. Every card will move 1 to the left. Once it leaves the edge of the board, it will then go to the opponent's space. So you really gotta be careful about where you place things, specifically around the left side, since that's gonna be instantly given over to your enemy. With defeating the 4th and final, we move on to the 3rd act. And again, if you've made it to this point, you've either played this game or you haven't. I warned you. I told you. You've overheard a lot. On to Act 3. So as you go to challenge whatever scribe you set to replace, or picking a different one, PO3 steps in. And around the first round, ends up throwing in the thing he dredged up from the old data. So things throughout the game itself have been strange, weird, outside of, how everyone in here is reacting, but minor glitches, weird files, things you might stumble upon. And PO3 uses that to hijack the game the way Leshy did. And we're back to a 3D table with PO3 being our dealer. This time, however, we don't have the sacrifices, bones, gems, all those mechanics are gone. The one that remains for resources are the power cells. This isn't to say the other sigils and interactives are gone, in fact it might be a little more interactive. It's just that the sacrifice, bones, and gems specifically are gone. Though alongside 3D, we turn to the roguelite of the maps, dying, having to start over at a certain point, and then moving along it again. The way you make your deck, the throwaway deck, the book, the bell, the scale, it's all here. And when working with PO3 to create the Transcendence, you have to fight 4 Uberbots. So it's like the last world in the sense that there's 4 different bosses across the map, each one with their own mechanics, not necessarily in the cards, but the area and the boss fight itself. You have the Archivist, which every round you kill certain enemies, you can actually get additional points based off the files you pick from your computer. You have Golly, which ends up pulling images and even certain cards from the internet, both that you're sending and gaining to play in the battle. You have the Photographer, which ends up taking pictures of the board and then you can place it down again. And the last Uberbot isn't here. As in, it's the unfinished Uberbot, as you make the mechanics. You can totally make it busted. Even the game itself promotes you to make it busted. In your favor, that is. In your favor. You can make it hard as you want, but you can have the entire boss's mechanics go in your favor. There's the bounty hunters, the additional bot coins, certain dangerous upgrades of boosting their stats, but if they die in the game, they're just gone. Making certain cards not just on death, but with certain machines. Every time you defeat an Uberbot, adding additional sigil to the empty vessels. New puzzles outside, moving around PO3's factory, and dredging up the secrets where you can. But it is here, well, every story comes to an end. And when moving in the factory, you find the scribes hiding away. Their plan is to ambush PO3 during his Transcendence, which, if you looked at the Uberbots of, you have an unfinished boss that you had to finish, you then had one that takes pictures of the game itself, you had another which looks through your own files, and Golly which looks through the internet. PO3 is trying to spread Inscryption from this one floppy disk to the internet itself, wanting to spread with him on top of the game. But it's during this upload that Leshy takes a more direct approach to their conflict. And in this moment of being coaxed to start a new game and return the status quo, Grimoire deletes Inscryption. You wander through the game, still in 3D, going through not just PO3's, but all of them. You go through what Grimoire's 3D would have looked like. You go through the chessboard, one of her initial boss fights, and then a final handshake. Back to Leshy's cabin, playing Inscryption again, and just wanting a final game. Even when the scale itself is gone, just to keep playing. And a final handshake. And with Magnificus, as the world is falling apart, and holy shit is that Yu-Gi-Oh! He goes down with a bit more of a fight, the flashiest one of the bunch, but mechanically the least dense. Though in his flashy stride, that doesn't stop the fact that everything around is falling apart. And even as everything's falling apart, and even when he fails, he still goes for the handshake. One that's never returned. But even after everything, after all the scribes are gone, and just looking back on this game before going to the whatever's beyond the edge of the epilogue, this is an amazing game. If you haven't played it, I'm sorry that I've spoiled this for you. I really am. I'm being honest there. Going through this blind was amazing. There are so many different turns, questions, learning the mechanics just to begin with, not having any strategy to begin, and then just going back to the start over and over again, but pushing further and further. The fact that the mechanical loop hooked me in, and the story hooked me further, just for this fantastic combination of a game. I highly recommend this game, and for those who have watched, you've either already played the game yourself, have it, and for those who just kept watching because of curiosity, to either group, to both groups. I recommend you recommend this game to other people. Not to watch a video on it, not to see a playthrough of it, to play it. This is a blast. It was just fun. Mechanically hooking, gripping, and story-wise, enthralling. And an emotional gut punch at the end. That, Leshy asking just to keep playing really hurt. But we move on to what's at the end of the epilogue. The old data. Something that's been buried in this disc for whatever reason, for however long, and doing whatever it is it's doing. And as you go to approach it, you end up... Thank you for watching the video, and thank you to my patrons! Which, without you, the show wouldn't be a thing. Now, on to the next deck of next week. No, the deck for next week. Oh, man. Who are you? You're not him. Wait!